Oh yes, yours truly was fortunate enough to get a chance to play Marvel's Spider-Man 2 early, and I have a lot, and I mean a lot to share and a lot to talk about. First and foremost, for full disclosure purposes, I do want to mention that Sony and PlayStation flew me out to Los Angeles and paid for accommodations in order to participate in this event. So of course, I obviously would like to disclose that to you guys so that you would be aware fully right up front. Now, with that in mind, let's dive into the good stuff, and that is the actual impressions. I'd like to first and foremost lay down a little bit of groundwork and foundation so that you have a good idea of context for what we played. And with that in mind, let's get into it. So first and foremost, we were told that the build that we were playing is around 6 weeks old, which means that by now the game is already quite a bit more polished than even the version that we were playing, which is kind of stunning considering how polished the game felt already. In addition to that, we were also given roughly around 2 to maybe around 3.5 hours or so, depending on how long you would actually play, because some people would play for a bit, then go get some snacks, etc., and come back. So it really kind of depended on how you decided to approach it. For me, I sat down, planted myself, and pretty much played for as long as I possibly could. So with that in mind, what did I think? Now, first and foremost, worry not, I will not be doing any sort of spoiler stuff here aside from like actually discussing the abilities and some of the gameplay functionality, but story-wise, I will tread very, very carefully to avoid any type of spoilers. If you like spoilers and if you want to see spoilery discussions, don't worry, I've got that coming up as well, but that will be in a separate video. That way you do not have to get spoiled if you don't want to. Now, what did I think? Well, to me, as someone who has played a lot of games early, I've been fortunate enough to play many, many titles over the years early, and I will say that this probably was the most smooth running game I've ever seen this far out, because to me, it almost played like something that could pretty much release there and then. Like, it was that much of a smooth experience beyond one hiccup, which again, I'm always going to be very, very upfront with you guys. I did manage to freeze the game once and had to basically load up the game again in order to continue. Fortunately enough, I did not lose any sort of progress or anything like that. And the PlayStation representative that was there actually ended up saying, hey, thank you, because now that's something that we could look into and make sure that it is fixed for launch. But believe me, I put the game to the test. I mean, I was going from web wings into web swinging, into acrobatics, into diving down, into air tricks, to just make sure that I am kind of testing out all the different facets and really feel whether or not it is polished and it's working. And again, like I said, with that one exception, in around 3 hours of gameplay, I really was pleasantly surprised that everything ran unbelievably smoothly. So since I've brought up Traversal, let's talk about the Traversal. The Traversal was one of the things that I was most curious about going into this experience, predominantly because obviously we know about the web wings. That was something that we've already heard was going to be included here. And I will say, before we dove into the actual play session, they showed us the trailer that you guys just saw on the State of Play event. And during that trailer, we saw a lot of web wings moments. And I thought to myself, you know, I wonder if this is kind of like spliced to match the music and if it's kind of edited to move faster than it seems, because I was like, there's no way that the web wings move that fast. Well, let me tell you something, especially when you're going through any of the slipstreams or the wind tunnels, you move that fast. Like, you literally, I don't even understand how it works in terms of what sort of wizardry they're doing with the web wings technology, but it moves very quickly and feels very intuitive and very satisfying to utilize. And by the way, that is not to say that the web swinging is now somehow an inferior system. It's still plenty fun. I just think that I was personally caught off guard by just how much fun I had with the web wings, because I before kind of thought that the web wings would be something that I would maybe use every now and again, but I would much more prefer the active participation of web swinging. However, I caught myself, especially in the latter half of the trailer, utilizing the web wings probably equally as much, if not maybe even a little more than the web swinging, which I think kind of articulates to you just how intuitive and fun it is actually to use. But most importantly, it's just a lot of fun to string it together with the existing web swinging mechanics. So you're able to tie it in with some of the existing systems and it just adds this extra layer of complexity to the traversal of the city. And speaking of the city, all I have to say is wow. I was very, very impressed by what they did here. It feels like all the sections that are new definitely stand out and feel very different to what we have experienced before with the main part of New York, which is much more obviously filled with high rises and feels like a dense downtown core, whereas the newer boroughs are much more kind of like suburban, and they really do have a completely different sort of aesthetic and vibe than what we've experienced in Marvel Spider-Man and Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales. But what made the city even cooler was just seeing how much more detailed everything was, whether it be the way that the trees would actually look, the way that the plants around the city looked, or the sheer amount of people or cars in the city was just legitimately kind of surprising. I was surprised that everything felt so alive and so much denser. I felt a little creepy crawling on the sides of buildings and looking through windows, but the main reason why I wanted to test that is to see how much of an upgrade did they make on that front. And they certainly did do an upgrade, because a lot of the interiors looked different instead of just being a copy paste image, which was very cool to see. But then the other thing that was interesting was that there were actual people inside the buildings. So all of that is the sort of little additions that we did not see in the previous titles that make the overall kind of like hub world itself feel just much more alive and denser and like a real city. So the next thing I want to talk about is actually the music, or I guess audio as a whole. The soundtrack, to me at least, immediately stood out because it really did an excellent job of capturing moments that felt dynamic or hopeful or peaceful when they needed to be, but then at the same time balancing it with the really exciting sequences, whether it be a boss fight sequence or something that would like escalate the stakes. It really was very well engineered from that standpoint. And I know that some people will probably find this to be a bit of a weird point to bring up when it comes to audio, but I was very impressed by the audio design on the gadgets, the abilities as well. Don't get me wrong, like the abilities sound really cool too, especially for Miles, because his brand new evolved Venom Shock abilities are absolutely stellar, and the symbiote abilities sound really cool too. But the thing that really stood out to me for some odd reason, I don't know if it was the headphones that I was wearing at the event, but the gadgets sounded really freaking cool. We only got to use 2 gadgets, but they both sound terrific. They have a lot of bass and they have a lot of weight to them, so they just really sound great. And speaking of sounding great, I can't wait for you guys to hear the lizard, because my goodness, those are some blood-curdling noises.
Hey Doc, ready for your annual physical?
So next, let's talk about the gameplay, because that's probably the thing that I think most people are most interested about and have the most amount of questions about. Well, to me, the best way that I could describe it is very intuitive and almost rhythmic, if that makes any sense. Like, first and foremost, they introduce, of course, the pairing system, and legitimately, it really does change things up quite a bit. And it does feel like the combat becomes quite a bit more layered. I did experiment with the combat in order to test whether or not you can actually play the game the way that we used to in the previous 2 titles. And you can certainly do that. You can, to a certain extent, avoid some of the pairing. If, let's say, you just hate the pairing mechanic or something like that, you can get through a lot of the battles without having to parry. However, the pairing is very intuitive. It does not feel like it requires some weird timing or some finessed skill. It just works, which I was very pleasantly surprised by. But the most important thing is that once you get a grasp of the pairing and you start incorporating it into your previous skill set from the 2 other games, it really starts to feel like you get into this rhythm where things are just working super duper well, with between parrying, between dodging, between being able to still slide underneath several enemies, being able to knock them up with a punch up, and of course utilizing a lot of your new abilities and gadgets as you're sequencing it along with everything that I previously mentioned, and it just starts to feel like you're almost playing a rhythm game. It starts to feel like you're a conductor in a symphony where you're really starting to pop off. And I have never felt like more of a superhero than I did in the last 30 minutes or so of my playtime with the game. I was just really having a blast being able to coordinate all these things together, and it really genuinely felt like I was an incredibly powerful character. Now, as I just mentioned, abilities, they play a pretty major factor in the combat, or at least they did from my experience with the game. I really found myself utilizing the abilities much more so than even the gadgets, which is something that I would never be able to say for even the Miles Morales video game, because I feel like even in that game, I would utilize the gadgets more often than I would the abilities. Here, that was not the case. Maybe that's because of the fact that we only had access to 2 gadgets, whereas the ability wheels were full for both Peter and Miles. But especially when playing as Peter, I found myself constantly wanting to use the symbiote abilities because they were just freaking awesome. They just make you feel super duper powerful, which is kind of funny to think that almost the experience that Peter would have with the symbiote, where he is kind of drawn in with the incredible immense power that he would get from the symbiote, you as the player kind of have a similar experience as well with the symbiote abilities, because they make you feel incredibly powerful. You really do feel like you want to utilize them as often as possible because they feel like they do that little bit of extra damage. They sound cool, they look brutal, and so because of that, you just kind of want to utilize them as much as you possibly can. And if you're a Miles Morales fan, fear not. He's got some sweet abilities as well, including his brand new evolved Venom Shock abilities that work exceptionally well, especially I noticed in a sequential order. They work really well depending on what kind of situation you're in. If you use them in the right sort of sequence, you can pull off some unbelievably cool looking combos. There were multiple times where I would do a combo and I literally wanted to like put down the controller, stand up, and give myself a round of applause. It really truly makes you feel like a superhero when you pull off one of those incredible sequences, tying together, let's say, your 4 abilities, but then maybe you throw in a gadget in there, plus some of your other skills that you were carried over from Marvel Spider-Man and Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales. And when it all comes together, it is absolutely fantastic. To me, the combat in Marvel Spider-Man 2 felt the most superhero out of all 3 games, and with a lot of emphasis on the word super. It just genuinely felt a lot more powerful, and it felt like truly focusing on that kind of a fantasy of being a superhero. I feel like this game captures that more so than any of the others. And of course, we also have to talk about the visuals. How does the game look? Does it actually look good? Does it look like a PlayStation 5 game? Is it worthy of being a PlayStation 5 only game? Yes. I think that everything that I saw from this game does not in any way, shape, or form strike me personally as something that could run on a PS4. There's just simply too many mechanics and systems going on here to be able to run, especially at a smooth frame rate, on the PS4. It's too dense. There's too many cool elements of lights. There was a lot of destructibility to the environments, like especially when I was playing through a mission where you were inside the Emily May Foundation and there was a lot of debris and a lot of stuff flying everywhere. I was so taken aback by just how destructible the environment was that I was very surprised. I really could not believe that they went as far as they did. There's fire, there's electricity sparking in the background. It just really takes all those little details that you expect from a modern day game and cranks it up to 11. So now that we covered a lot of the big topics, you know, the gameplay, the audio, the traversal, I did also want to share some of these other smaller things that I spotted that I think are really cool about the game as well. So first and foremost, let's talk about one of the most controversial aspects of the previous 2 games, and that is the difficulty. More specifically, the difficulty of the boss fights, or I guess even more specifically than that, the lack of difficulty with the boss fight. And I'm glad to report that the one big boss fight that we got to play through, which was the lizard, was a lot more challenging. It actually required you to be on your toes, and you really needed to have your game on. They cranked up the difficulty by adding, at least with the lizard, multiple stages to the fight. so that even when you go through the first health bar, which by the way, yes, bosses actually have a health bar now, you still then have an additional sequence to go through. So you really do have to be on your guard, and you really need to bring your best superhero game. Furthermore, if you want a challenge, I did complete one of Kraven's hunter bases, like the hidden hunter bases. And I gotta be honest, it was pretty freaking challenging. Like, it actually did require me to be very careful. I was at one point at very low health with all of my abilities on cooldown and all of my gadgets having run out of ammo. So I was just kind of scrambling around trying to figure out how I could possibly defeat one of these brutes that Kraven throws at you, where he has essentially like a giant shield and a giant weapon, kind of like a mace axe looking thing. And it was genuinely difficult. Like, you really did need to play it correctly. Those attacks that the enemy throws at you need to be not just parried, but parried multiple times sequentially in order to count as a counter. So it really does require some skill and some thought. And of course, again, I'm sure that once we all get to play this game for 10, 15, 20 hours, 100 hours in the case of someone like myself, I'm sure that it will become easier. But I feel like that is true for pretty much any game. The more time you spend with the title, the more you learn how it works, and the more you become better at the mechanics that the game throws at you. I did also get a chance to try out the photo mode, and it pretty much runs very similar to Marvel's Spider-Man and Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. In fact, I couldn't really spot any sort of differences. Like, it pretty much had all the same features in terms of being able to control like field of view, being able to move the camera freely or lock in on your character, being able to remove the characters, remove the background characters. It really pretty much functions in an identical manner, which, hey, I think that's a great thing, because once again, the photo mode in those previous games was terrific. Next, I also wanted to talk about the menus, or I guess kind of the user interface as a whole. It felt very clean. I really do think that it felt a little bit more simplified than the previous titles, where there was just kind of, it felt like there was a lot more on the screen. Here, because a lot of your abilities are actually shared between Miles and Peter, it feels a lot more streamlined. I like that for several of your abilities, they did have you choose almost like along a skill tree which abilities you wanted to pick. So you kind of went through a either or option, which almost allows you to kind of have some light RPG elements where you're kind of building your own variant of Spider-Man, or I guess focusing on specific elements of how you want your Spider-Man to play. And speaking of making choices, I really was pleasantly surprised by the suits. The suits was something that I was just kind of taken aback by, because obviously we have heard that there would be color variants for the suits, but boy, oh boy, some of these color variants were absolutely gorgeous. Like, they provided us with 5 suits for each one of the characters. So for Miles, he had his upgraded suit, his 2099 suit, his 10th anniversary suit, his Puerto Rico inspired suit, and the encoded suit, while Pete had the advanced suit, the symbiote suit, the webbed Sam Raimi suit, which was very cool to see. He had the Secret Wars Civil War suit and the apocalyptic suit. So lots and lots of different art styles and variants there. But again, even though not every suit has a recolor, so for example, a suit like the previously mentioned symbiote Raimi suit, that one is stuck with the color that it is, and it is one edit style. However, for example, the advanced suit had an edit style that flips the blue color to become black. And I got to tell you guys, it was my favorite looking costume. It looks absolutely freaking gorgeous. And so I've done a lot of gushing about Marvel's Spider-Man 2. It sounds like it's probably the best game ever made. It's going to be the game of the year, right? Well, I would say kind of. For some people, it certainly will be. I think for me, if the game, once it drops on October 20th, is similar in terms of what I got to experience in person during this event, I do think that it will be my game of the year. However, I do also want to mention that obviously this is the 3rd entry in a series of games. So of course, if let's say you did not like those previous 2 games, this game definitely does a lot that is new, but it still most certainly carries off a lot of the mechanics from the previous games into this one. A lot of the things that made those 2 previous games successful. There's a reason why people bought those games as much as they did. There's a reason why those games received such good reviews. And so it just makes sense that obviously for the 3rd entry, they would still implement a lot of those similar ideas that they had for the first two games. So again, don't expect this to suddenly be like a FPS or just a completely different genre of game. It's still a Marvel Spider-Man game. It's just pretty much better across the board in every facet, whether it be the density of the city, the scale of everything is just cranked up a notch, the lighting, the attention to detail, the combat has so much more layers now. The traversal is most definitely improved upon, especially with the addition of the web wings. The audio design, engineering, sound effects, score, and voice acting are all terrific, and I really am not going into any of the story stuff just because I'm trying to keep this first impressions video as spoiler free as possible, but I will talk about that in depth as well and why I think it's so exciting on that front, which again, for me as someone who plays a lot of games for the story, I'm very, very excited about the story choices that they made during this play session. What I got to see here is pretty exciting in terms of what it could possibly mean for the full campaign. And so there you have it. Those are my first impressions for Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Once again, I do want to take a quick moment and first and foremost thank you guys, because without your guys' support, none of this would be possible. So huge thank you to you. Then I would like to thank obviously Sony and PlayStation for flying me out once again to LA and taking care of accommodation so that I could participate in this event and play what is my personal most highly anticipated game of the year in person. Was just such a privilege and such a joy. So I definitely am super duper thankful to participate in that. And of course, guys, make sure that you're subscribed. Make sure you have your notifications turned on because I've got a ton of other videos. They are definitely going to be a lot more spoiler heavy. So if you don't want to actually hear any spoilers, be careful about the upcoming set of videos that I'll be dropping. But there's some really, really cool and exciting revelations to discuss that I was able to spot during my play sessions as well. With all that in mind, thanks out for watching. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out. See you later. The Gators.